Good evening, everyone, both here in the room and online. We are ready to start this public lecture by Professor Marion Meyer, who is spending 2 weeks in Trento as a visiting professor and teaching a doctoral seminar dedicated to sites and space in Athens, in late archaic and early classical Athens. Marion Meyer will be introduced by Professor Maurizio Giangiulio.
Dirò poche parole in italiano. Sono molto lieto e molto onorato di poter presentare Marion Meyer alla fine delle sue attività, ma questo non è importante, siamo tutti molto presi. So che nelle sue lezioni, i suoi seminari hanno avuto un grande riscontro con gli studenti e c'era naturalmente da aspettarselo. Chi conosce la vivacità intellettuale, la passione, il coinvolgimento nella ricerca di Marion Meyer doveva prevederlo, così è stato, ne siamo molto contenti e devo ringraziare in modo particolare Giorgia Proietti per aver voluto e contribuito moltissimo alla riuscita di questo invito di Marion Meyer nell'ambito del PRIN, del programma di ricerca di interesse nazionale di cui è PI. Dico solo che Marion Meyer è un tipo di, se posso, un tipo di archeologo che piace molto agli storici, nel senso che certamente ha una incredibile padronanza di tutto ciò che è iconografia, rappresentazione, immagine, ma al tempo stesso ha una competenza straordinaria su quelli che sono i siti, i contesti, i luoghi in Grecia, ad Atene specialmente, ma anche in Asia Minore. E poi ha un interesse per i fenomeni di acculturazione, di integrazione culturale, dalla Cilicia all'Asia Minore in generale. E poi ha una sensibilità, diciamo, con delle sfumature teoriche anche per problematiche come quella dell'eroismo, che sembra un tema molto tradizionale, invece non lo è affatto. Ehm, e infine il suo studio della figura di Atena ad Atene sull'Acropoli rivela una competenza filologica e testuale invidiabile e che insomma non è poi così frequente, non è così normale di trovare, come peraltro non è normale di trovare presso gli storici competenze archeologiche e a volte anche filologiche. Quindi abbiamo insomma avuto l'occasione, sono sicuro che anche questa sera avremo l'occasione di ascoltare una rappresentante dell'Altertumswissenschaft tedesca nella sua migliore, ricordiamo, nella sua migliore configurazione. Ricordiamo che la nostra ospite è stata allieva di Nikolaus Himmelmann. E ecco, non dico niente di più, la ringrazio infinitamente per essere venuta, per aver condiviso, diciamo, le nostre giornate, quelle degli studenti, di essere stata così disponibile. Mi spiace, gliel'ho detto personalmente, non aver potuto partecipare quanto avrei voluto, ma appunto domenica sono rientrato dalla Sicilia, domani vado in Svizzera, insomma. E quindi così, grazie infinite, veramente grazie molte, e siamo tutti pronti ad ascoltare quello che ci dirai su Atene, su siti e spazi nel contesto ateniese. Grazie ancora. Mi vado a sedere così vedo meno.
Ah, sì.
Tocca a me ringraziare molto e davvero da cuore a te, Maurizia, a Giorgia, per l'invito e per questa introduzione veramente molto speciale. I think we have to continue in English because we don't have one of our nice courses, but public lecture. So I will proceed in that language and tell you something about sites and spaces in Athens in the 6th and 5th century. And I have to say that I had thought that public lecture was something like, we have in Germany and in Austria, like Vorträge für die Freunde und Förderers. I expected, not such an expert audience. So you must forgive me if I say things, that might sound rather self-evident to you. Sites and spaces sound like appropriate topics for an archaeologist, but the exploration and interpretation of the use and function of sites and spaces take the effort of scholars of various disciplines, and I can offer just one perspective. I use site as a topographical term for a functional entity that exists physically at one particular location. A site can be a single entity or a combination of entities. For example, an altar can be an entity, an altar can be a site, but the sanctuary it belongs to and the city the sanctuary is located in may also be called sites. The spatial turn of the late 1980s paved the way for conceptualizing space not just as a physical category, defined, measurable, with fixed, visible limitations, but as a cultural category, as the result of social relations. As Jeremy Inerney put it, space is a set of culturally constructed relations. When I speak about space in ancient Athens, space has a material aspect and refers to a location. But the notion of space as a construction of social relations adds a dynamic factor. A physical space can change its character and function and turn into a different social space according to the persons acting in it and according to the kind of activities performed. Public and private, sacred and profane are categories of social anthropology that have been useful tools for classifications, but they draw lines where, in reality, there are combinations. Public space in a Greek city is commonly defined and subdivided by function as follows. Sacred space of shared sanctuaries and shrines for the cult of gods and other superhuman powers. Space for profane activities of the community according to the political, administrative, juridical tasks and the economic, commercial, and individual interests of its members. And space for the dead. These spheres were not neatly separated from each other. There were cult sites in every building of a political function, and there were no secluded necropolis or cemeteries, but the tombs lined up along frequented roads. Is everything okay?
I apologize. I'm going to share the screen with the spectators online.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no.
Oh.
Okay, go. Thank you.
Grazie, mille grazie. This was just the second slide was an example of a sacred space, profane space, and here the area of one of the best known and best documented cemeteries. In my presentation, I will concentrate on two sites and their relation to other sites as examples of how sites can refer either to the space they are situated in and thereby guide the spectator's perception of that space, or to a space at some distance and thereby appeal to the spectator's memory or imagination. My first example leads us to the sanctuary of Athena on the Acropolis. In the archaic period, after a long tradition of mixed use for defense and retreat, settlement, burying, and worshipping, the Acropolis had become a space reserved for cult. The main cult was the one for Athena, the tutelary goddess of Athens, and there were cult sites for other divinities and local heroes and heroines. From the third quarter of the 5th century on, the sanctuary was dominated by the Parthenon, the biggest building and the one most lavishly decorated with sculpture. Let's see how some of these sculptures point to the sacred space around them. The main facade of the temple was in the east, where the entrance to the cella was, and where, when the doors were opened, one could see the gigantic statue of Athena Parthenos, made of gold and ivory. If you turned from the main pathway to this side and towards the entrance, you could see at the outside of the temple 3 sets of sculptures that all included an image of Athena. The biggest image in the pediment showed the birth of the goddess, as we know from a passage in Pausanias. The center of the composition with the figure of the goddess is lost, but can be tentatively restored. Whereas in earlier image, well, you see an example here, Athena had emerged from the head of her father Zeus with only few witnesses. In the pediment, she appeared in full size and many gods were present, some of them not yet aware of the event. The metopies underneath display the gigantomachy, that is, the joint fight of the Olympian gods against the giants, and Athena, accompanied by Nike, who embodies victory, appears on slab 4. Both myths, Athena's birth and the gigantomachy, were traditional myths at the time the Parthenon was built, and they were well-known myths the Athenians shared with other Greeks. If the visitors came closer and approached the entrance, they could see Athena a third time on the frieze that adorned the outside of the cella about 1 meter high. One would not expect a frieze, that is a continuous relief band, in a building of the Doric order, and one would certainly not expect the subject the Parthenon frieze offers. 3 sides, the west and the long north and south sides, showed mortals on their way east, parading on horseback, performing the Apobates race, carrying musical instruments, and offering tables, leading sacrificial animals. And on the east frieze, girls and women marched towards the center, carrying cult instruments. You can see some jugs and fiale and timiaterion here. The slab above the door featured also mortal figures in 2 cult scenes. And to both sides, 12 Olympian gods were seated as if to receive the worshippers. Those closest to the center were Athena here and her father Zeus to the left. The frieze, 160 meters long, showed the whole city worshipping Athena, and thereby self-referentially demonstrated what the temple itself was part of, the Athenians' cult of the goddess. The frieze thus firmly tied the temple not only to the space where it was manifestly and permanently located up to this very day, it also visualized and perpetuated its ultimate purpose, the cult for Athena. By that, I do not mean that any of the activities shown on the frieze were performed inside the Parthenon. In fact, none were, but there can be no denying the fact that the construction of the building with its elaborate images and the dedication of the impressive statue of Athena Parthenos inside were an act of piety and an expression of cult for the goddess. The frieze visualized a social space created every time when the female cult servants would act or when worshippers would come with sacrifices, and the Apobatai reminded of activities at the most extensive and collective Athenian cult activity, the festival of the Panathenaia. I do not think that the frieze is a depiction of this particular festival, but that's another issue. We, the modern visitors, are still affected by this duality of space. We can go up to the Acropolis and experience the site with the temples and the walkways. We can view even some of the images, but we cannot experience the social space because we are not worshippers of Athena. The frieze is extraordinary. However, in one aspect, it blends in nicely with both the images of the pediment and the metropolis. It presents Athena together with her family of Olympian gods. Although this is a temple for Athena and her statue stands inside, the goddess is accompanied by 11 other gods. So, despite the differences in subjects, mythical events in the pediment and the metropiece, mortal worshippers in the frieze, the images of Athena agree in presenting the goddess as a member of the Olympian family, in a pan-Hellenic aspect, so to speak, as any non-Athenian Greek would see her too. The visitors who came to the east facade had, however, already passed the backside of the temple, the west side, the one that appears in view when one leaves the Propylaea. At the west side, Athena appears only once, in the pediment, the biggest image. It is better documented and better preserved than the east pediment, and the work of generations of archaeologists has made it possible to reconstruct its composition. Pausanias mentions the subject in a short sentence. Pausanias strife, eris, with Athena about the land. This is a local Athenian myth, and it is about Athens and the Athenians. Poseidon disputed Athena's function as the main goddess of the Athenians and intended to replace her. But Zeus decided that Athena should remain the tutelary divinity of Athens. In contrast to the myths chosen for the entrance side of the Parthenon, this tale does not have a long tradition. The pediment is the earliest known image. Most literary sources are later, some of them much later, and the authors have a really hard time to make sense of a tale that questions Athena's position in Athens. And this is indeed irritating. It turns out that a core motif of Poseidon's challenge of established tutelary deities was shared by various cities around the Corinthian and the Rhonic Gulf and the Aegean, told in local variants. The basic idea is an antagonism of the forces of nature, embodied in Poseidon as the god of earthquakes and the sea, and the guardians of civilization, embodied by established tutelary gods of cities. And in the end of these local stories, Poseidon always either loses, as in Athens, or the strife ends with a tie. The pediment here shows Poseidon as antagonist of Athena in a moment of transition. Both gods were rushing towards each other, and Poseidon had transgressed into the part. We can't see this because there is now this here this like thank you. Here you see exactly where the middle is, and there you see that Poseidon has transgressed and he has entered into Athena's half of the pediment. But at the same moment, they are drawing back, refrained by Zeus, who is either invisibly present or whose thunderbolt appeared between the opponents, as suggested by Erika Simon. The chariots of the gods emphasize this moment of transition because the horses are in full course, but they are suddenly stopped. And in the corners, we see a lot of figures close together, among them many females and children. These are the heroes and heroines of Attica, that is, the antecedents of the Athenians. Though this image is all about a local issue, and specifically it is about the Acropolis as the nucleus of Athena's cult. Herodotus is the earliest literary source for the myth for the gods' strife, and he says that he heard about it from the Athenians. They said that the olive tree and the thalassa, the salt water, in the shrine of Erechtheus on the Acropolis had been set as martyria, as testimonies when the gods had their eris about the land. The location of Athena's olive tree and Poseidon's thalassa is confirmed by later authors. After the Erechtheion had been built, the thalassa was situated in the west cella, as seen by Pausanias, whereas the olive tree stood in the open-air sanctuary of Pantrosos, adjacent to the west wall of the Erechtheion, and a successor of the olive tree has been planted. What you see here in the left is a reconstruction of the area as studied by Papanikolaou with the not yet existing Erechtheion indicated in flighter lines. In Herodotus' time, the area of the future west cella of the Erechtheion had been an open-air sanctuary, just like the adjoining sanctuary of Pantrosos with the olive tree. And the historian could easily have taken the whole site as a shrine for Erechtheus. According to the Athenians in Herodotus' time, both martyria were created by the gods when they quarreled. I think that the olive tree was Athena's traditional cult mark and much older than Poseidon's thalassa, but that is another issue. What matters in this context is the belief that the gods had manifested their presence on the Acropolis with tangible, permanent markers. And what about these martyria in the pediment with the myth? For the reconstruction of the composition, we have to rely on the drawing made in 1674, before the temple was severely damaged by the explosion 13 years later. The gods are about to retreat from each other, and both have their right arm raised, as you can see here. No doubt holding their specific attributes, the spear and the trident. They cannot, however, be shown in the course of producing their materia because the pediment focuses on this moment of separation, and furthermore, there is not enough space. The olive tree, already gone here before the explosion, can be reconstructed in the center of the pediment, as a Berger's reconstruction, behind Poseidon's leg, as suggested by two later Athenian bases, which diverged in detail, but they both have the olive tree between the two opponents. Poseidon's thalassa is represented by marine figures in his vicinity. The Ketos, a sea dragon, is still preserved in the 17th century, has gone, but there are remains of a sea snake that in the reconstruction of the New Acropolis Museum have been placed underneath the god's chariot. The materia here were handed as the gods' attributes, as signs that mark their characteristics, and they serve as proof of the gods' presence on the Acropolis. The pediment does not just present a local myth, it points to tangible cult sites in the sanctuary, cult sites that could be visited just a few meters to the north of the Parthenon. The arrows point to the position of the tree and the thalassa. Both were tangible evidence of the eris of the gods, as shown in the image, and they show that this eris had actually taken place on the Acropolis where the cult of Athena, who had met Poseidon's challenge, was to last forever. And again, the images of the temple facade blend in. On the metopiece, the so-called Attic Amazonomachy was to be seen, the Amazons' invasion of Attica, pushed back by the Athenians led by Theseus. The Attic Amazonomachy was a new variant of the traditional tale of fights with Amazons that had been told for Heracles and Theseus and also for both heroes as a joint campaign, but always far away. This new variant emerged only after the Persian Wars with the obvious intention to provide a mythical prototype for the defense against the Persians. The camp of the Amazons was said to have been right across the entrance of the Acropolis on the Areopagos, the hill of Ares, the father of the Amazons. The visitors standing in front of the west side of the Parthenon and viewing the pediment and the methopies thus saw scenes that had actually taken place at the spot where they were standing. And they saw Athena, about whom they knew that she had rebuffed Poseidon's challenge and remained the Athenians' tutelary goddess once and forever. These images testified to the Athenians' link to their goddess and to the goddess' link to this very spot. There are more spatial references in the Parthenon sculpture. In passing, I would like to point out just one more example. Of the 32 North metopes, only 14 survive, most of them heavily mutilated. On some of them, scenes of the fall of Troy can be identified because the composition of the images followed established traditions. One such composition extends over 2 slabs. It shows Helen hurrying to a statue, pursued by her former husband Menelaus, whose threatening attitude is emphasized by the shield he is carrying. Menelaus is accompanied by a comrade, and he is separated from Helen by the goddess Aphrodite, seen frontally, and her power is illustrated by the little Eros figure on her shoulder about to fly over to Menelaus in order to turn his rage against his ex-wife into love and desire. The encounter of Helen and Menelaus belongs to the repertoire of images of the fall of Troy ever since this tale appears in visual media. Around 500 BCE, Athenian vase painters introduced the figure of Eros into the scene, and thus anticipated what was considered a happy end. Menelaus did not harm Helen, but took her home to Sparta. We don't know about her feelings. As a consequence of Eros' interference, Menelaus, even when rushing towards Helena, dropped his sword. And on some of the vases of the mid-5th century, Eros reaches out to Menelaus, and here on this vase, you see that he is actually pouring some love potion into the eyes of the enraged ex-husband. In the early 5th century, Athenian vase painters had added another new element to the scene. In some images, Helen is seeking refuge in a sanctuary of Apollo. This composition is modeled on the traditional one for images of Cassandra. When Troy had fallen, the priestess fled to the statue of Athena, but was dragged away from it by Ajax, so-called Lesser Ajax, in order to distinguish him from the famous Ajax from Salamis. In archaic time, the victim is reduced in scale and sometimes partially hidden by the shield. So the images focus on Ajax and Athena and thus convey that Ajax's rape of Cassandra is an offense of the goddess. In the tale about Cassandra, the statue of Athena has a narrative function. Alktinos, in his epic poem Iliopersis, tells that the statue of the goddess fell down when Ajax went after the priestess, and the statue also figures prominently in Alcaeus' poem about the event. The encounter of Helen and Menelaus is, however, never associated with any statue in any literary source. The statue of Apollo is a purely visual means of conveying that Helen, at this moment, is still in Troy and part of the city, and that is why Apollo, the god who acts in favor of the Trojans, has been chosen. The designer of the Parthenon metopy adopted and adapted this composition. Helen is fleeing to an under-life-sized statue, but not one of Apollo. Enough is preserved to see that the figure stands in a stiff position without contrapposto, draped in a garment without any folds. This is a statue of a female figure and, as its style betrays, one of pre-classical times. In this context, it must be an image of Athena, and this is confirmed by a jug made just a few years after the Parthenon metopy that repeats the scene and actually shows Athena in the so-called Palladion type. A statue of Athena in a scene of the fall of Troy must have evoked the traditional images of Cassandra fleeing to Athena and must have triggered a comparison of both women. They were both pursued by enraged warriors. For a moment, Helen was in the same danger as Cassandra was. In the next moment, their fates could not differ more. Cassandra met a brutal attack. Helen was reinstalled as a loved wife and as a queen. The fact that in the metopy, Apollo had been replaced by Athena gave this contrast another twist. After all, this is an image in a sanctuary of Athena. The most sacred object in the sanctuary was the ancient agalma of the goddess, made of olive wood and clad in a peplos and housed just a few meters to the north of the Parthenon. This agalma had stood in the late archaic temple here that had been burned by the Persians, and after the Persian wars, it had been taken to an Aiskos that was then integrated into the east cella of the Erechthaion. The agalma of Athena was the most distinctive component of this building, of the building we call Erechthaion, as is revealed by a 5th century inscription that calls the building actually Temple of on the Acropolis, in which the Archaion agalma is. This ancient statue of Athena, as important as it was for the cult, does not appear in Athenian imagery. There is not a single image that can be identified as its representation. And I certainly do not want to suggest that here we have one. However, the metopy does show an ancient agalma of Athena instead of the expected one of Apollo. If in the image Helen seeks refuge at an ancient statue of the goddess, the visitors will have remembered the long tradition that the ancient agalma of Athena on the Acropolis had as a site of asylum. And they will not have missed the point made by this change of expected iconography. They knew that in Troy, Athena had not helped Cassandra, the Trojan. If she here offered a safe haven to Helen, the Greek, she would sure protect other Greeks as well. Although this was an image of an event that in the visitors' minds had happened in the remote past, it made a potent statement about the present and the future, a main function of myth. And it related the basic message of the image, divine help, to the actual location and the actual spectators. With these two examples of images at the Parthenon that refer to cult sites and cult objects on the Acropolis, I want to close this first part and turn to my second example. Let's turn to the second public space in Athens, the Agora, and to a site that looks a lot less spectacular than the Parthenon. We have to take into account that the Acropolis was virtually stripped of any evidence prior to and later than the second half of the 5th century. Whereas on the Agora, we see the remains of vibrant activities in the course of about a millennium. The time I want to focus on is the turn of the 6th to the 5th century, late archaic times, about 2 generations before the Parthenon was planned and built. The history of the site we nowadays call the Athenian Agora is complex and very disputed, and this dispute has much to do with our definition of an agora. There's wide agreement that an agora requires an open space suitable for the gathering of many people for various activities, political and juridical assemblies, festivals and cult practice, trade and commerce, announcement, casual meetings and interaction, philosophy and gossip. For a lot of scholars, the political function is essential, and in the case of Athens, the function of the agora as the arena for the performance of democracy had stood in the center of attention. I cannot discuss this here, but let me say that the Athenians had more than one location for the procedures required for their self-government. There was an ancient agora to the east of the Acropolis, and there was the meeting place for the assembly of the demos at the Pnyx west of the Acropolis. The slightly sloping area north of the Areopagos and east of the Agoraios hill had been used for habitation and workshops for centuries. But this private use was pushed to the margins of the area in the course of the early 6th century. When the festival of the Panathenaia was reorganized in 566 and the great Panathenaia founded, the Panathenaic Way was inaugurated, a broad passageway for the procession that crossed this area from the northwest to the entrance of the Acropolis. And long rows of steps were cut into the hill, providing a theatron, a site to watch not only the procession of the Panathenaia, but then also other cult activities like those of for Dionysos. Throughout the 6th century, there were very few permanent built installations. The biggest one was the enigmatic building F of disputed function, a complex of rooms around a courtyard, which is a unique feature as such. In the later 6th century, 2 structures were erected that do not only attest to the public use of this space, but also to its function as the center of the polis. In 522-21, a grandson of the former tyrant Pisistratos dedicated the altar of the 12 gods, and this altar subsequently served as the navel of the city from which distances were measured. In the southeast, a fountain house was erected, which provided the luxury of running water and surely became a frequented meeting place. Athenian vases of the late 6th century testify to the popularity of such sites. After the Cleisthenic reforms of 508-07, structures for political functions were erected along the slope of Agoraios Hill. The Stoa Basileios, the office of the archon responsible for cult matters, and the Bouleuterion, the council for the 500, connected with the sanctuary for Mater, the mother of the gods. Boundary stones were set up that marked the agora as a defined space, a space that could be organized according to the occasion and to which access could be denied. And in the southwest, where the northern slope of the Areopagos had flattened, a large court was erected. It was excavated in 1953 and dated to the end of the 6th century, according to the archaeological evidence. This rectangular peribolos, as it became known in scholarship, had been built as an open-air precinct, as its foundation revealed, with an entrance to the north toward the open space of the agora. After a severe destruction, it was rebuilt and then remodeled at least twice in the middle of the 4th century and once more 2 centuries later. It is the original structure that interests us here. The dimensions are stunning. With 31 by 26.5 meters, this rectangular peribolos covers 822 square meters, much more than the Bouleuterion that gave room for 500 Bouleutai. For such an enormous open-air precinct in this location, the function of a law court seemed to suggest itself. The structure was identified as the Heliaiai, the law court in Athens with the biggest number of jurors, changing according to occasion. A marble stele found in an excavation in the Agora in 1986 caused a big surprise when its inscription was published in 1998 by Ronald Stroud. It contained a decree decided by the Athenians in 374-73 about taxes for the import of grain from islands under Athenian control and regulations for the sale of the grain by public officials. The grain should be brought from Piraeus to the city, stored in the Aiakeion, and sold in the Agora by officials explicitly elected for these jobs. And in line 14 and 15, the inscription says that the polis will provide a roof and a door or doors for the Aiakeion. Aiakeion means shrine for Aiakos. The existence of such a shrine had been known for a long time. Herodotus reports its construction about 500 BCE and adds that the Aiakeion still existed on the Agora in his time. An inscription of the late 5th century mentions a house that lines the Aiakeion on one side and the Agora on the other side. A later writer implies that the Aiakeion was near the Tolos, a round building built in the years after the Persian Wars here on this spot. So it was known that somewhere in the southwestern part of the Athenian Agora, there was a cult site for Aiakos. But nobody had expected that this Aiakeion was so big that it could be used as a storeroom for several shiploads of grain. Stroud's identification of the rectangular peribolos, built at the end of the 6th century and remodeled later, with the Aiakeion, built around 500 in the southwestern part of the Agora, is compelling. And it forces to rethink about the Aiakeion and the motivations for the construction of this shrine. Aiakos was not an Athenian. Aiakos was a figure whom the inhabitants of Aegina claimed to be the proto-Aeginetan as such, a son of Zeus and the nymph Aegina, who gave her name to the island where she gave birth to Aiakos. Aegina is the island in the Saronic Gulf just south of Piraeus, the home of famous seamen and merchants. When Aiakos had grown up and felt lonesome, Zeus created the Myrmidons by transforming the local ants into humans. And these Aeginetans were the first ones to build ships and make sails. So this pays tribute to Aegina as the main maritime player in archaic times. Aiakos was, however, known in the Greek world as the ancestor of the heroes Peleus and his son Achilles, whose home was in Thessaly in central Greece. Achilles, the foremost fighter in Troy, is often called an Aeakid, a descendant of Aiakos, by Homer. Whether there had been a traditional hero in Aegina whose name happened to be Aiakos, or whether Thessalian Aiakos was imported, the Aeginetans constructed a local genealogy with figures who were not local. Thank you very much. They affiliated the Thessalian heroes Peleus and Achilles with Aeginetan Aiakos, and also made Telamon and his son Ajax, heroes of Salamis, members of their invented family of descendants of Zeus and the nymph Aegina. Because these figures were, however, well known as Thessalians and Salaminians, migration stories had to be invented in order to account for the curious fact that none of the most famous Aeginetan heroes actually lived on the island. So Peleus went to Thessaly and Telamon to Salamis. Philologists traced this Aeginetan myth-making to the 6th century. The Athenians apparently did not object to the Aeginetan construction of genealogy because it did not question that Ajax was a Salaminian. This was of central interest for the Athenians, who had quarreled with their neighbor Megara over the island until Salamis was firmly integrated into the Athenian state in the late 6th century. With the Cleisthenic reforms of 508-507, Ajax was made one of the eponymous heroes of the newly established 10 tribes and thus manifested that Salamis belonged to the Athenians. Iacchos, however, the Proto-Aeginetan, became involved in the antagonism of Athens and Aegina. Both states were neighbors who had competed on the trade market and also fought against each other in the course of the Archaic period. Their old enmity, as Herodotus calls it, burst into open warfare when the Aeginetans were called for help by the Thebans, who sought revenge for a recent defeat they had suffered from the Athenians in 506. As Herodotus reports the events, the Aeginetans sent the Aeacidae for support, apparently images of the heroes, because the Thebans, when they were defeated by the Athenians, returned them and asked the Aeginetans to send men instead. The Aeginetans recalled their old enmity with the Athenians and started an undeclared war, as Herodotus says. They plundered the harbor of Phaleron and many demes at the coast and thus harmed the Athenians considerably. When the Athenians were about to retaliate, they were advised by the Delphic oracle to wait for 30 years and fight the Aeginetans only then, after having established a temenos for Iacchos. Otherwise, they would suffer a lot. However, the Athenians were impatient. I quote Herodotus in the translation of Ronald Stroud: "When the Athenians heard these instructions, they laid out the temenos for Iacchos, the present one that is established on the Agora." End quote. In Herodotus' narrative, the foundation of an Aiakeion in Athens sounds like a reaction to the Aeginetans' previous mobilization of Aeacidae in help for the Thebans. I think that the passage about their images copies a much more trustworthy mention of their mission in the context of the Battle of Salamis. The appearance of the Aeacidae in the fighting of the late 6th century may be a later invention. The institution of a temenos for Iacchos, however, was not. Its existence is confirmed and its location in the southwestern part of the Agora suggested by the two later sources I mentioned before. The decision to found a temenos for the hero of an enemy in the context of open hostilities can be interpreted as an effort to break the force of the enemy by invoking and propitiating the same divine powers that the enemy would invoke. A shrine for Iacchos in Athens, therefore, would not be an extraordinary phenomenon. However, nobody had expected that a temenos for Iacchos would have these dimensions, and one cannot imagine any ceremonies taking place in that shrine that would demand so much space. Why was the Aiakeion so huge? I can think of no better explanation than the one Stroud already suggested, that the Aiakeion was not just a cult site for the Aeginetan hero, but that it actually copied his shrine on Aegina. The Aeginetan Aiakeion has not been located, but we have a description by Pausanias. He speaks of a square, open-air peribolos built of white stone, constructed at the most conspicuous spot of the city, with reliefs at the entrance showing delegates of Greeks who asked Iacchos to pray for rain because Zeus would respond only to him. Pausanias adds that the precinct contained old olive trees and an altar that was thought to be Iacchos' grave marker. Stroud points to the striking similarities between this Iaccheion and the one in Athens, an open square precinct of substantial size in a prominent location. Interestingly, the excavator of the 950s had stated that the walls of the Peribolos were built of Aeginetan limestone. If the Athenian Iaccheion had been designed as an imitation of the Aeginetan one, this would emphasize its intended function as a cult site equally effective as the original one. The Athenian Iaccheion would explicitly compete with the Aeginetan one, and the Athenian claim of appropriating Iacchos would have been an anti-Aeginetan action, just as Herodotus reported. In another paper, I suggested that the sculptures the Aeginetans displayed in the pediments of their early 5th century temple of Aphaia might have been a response to the Athenian appropriation of Iacchos. Both sets of sculptures show fights of Greeks against Trojans, and they feature heroes whom the Aeginetans claimed to be descendants of their Iacchos. The west pediment shows the fighting of Iacchos' grandsons Ajax and Achilles, the theme of Homer's Iliad, whereas the east pediment highlights Iacchos' sons Peleus and Telamon fighting in a previous campaign against Troy led by Heracles. These images underline the kinship of Achilles' family with Ajax' family and celebrate the excellence of these Aeginetans in the most prestigious war of the Greeks. This was a card with which the historical Aeginetans could beat the Athenians. No Athenian hero excelled in the Trojan War, whereas 2 generations of Aeginetans fought in Troy, among them the foremost Greek fighters Achilles and Ajax. I cannot discuss the disputed chronology of the pedimental sculpture here, but I want to point out that the sculptural program does not presuppose the Persian Wars or the Battle of Salamis, as has been suggested and accepted in recent years. The old enmity of Athens and Aegina had turned into open hostilities around 500 BCE, and in that context, the Athenians had challenged the Aeginetans by building a temenos of Iacchos on their agora. The Aeginetans might have responded by insisting on their genealogy of the Aeacids sooner or later. The Athenians and the Aeginetans reconciled when Xerxes threatened the Greeks in 481, and they fought and won as allies in the Battle of Salamis. However, in the end, the Athenians gained the upper hand. In 557, the Athenians, at the height of their power, forced the Aeginetans to join the Delian League and pay a heavy tribute fee. In 431, the Athenians banned the Aeginetans from the island, as they feared the Aeginetans would support their fellow Dorians, the Spartans, in the Peloponnesian War. After the Athenian defeat in 404, the exiled were allowed to come back, but Aegina never regained its former status as a prime city of trade and art. To sum up, I have presented 2 very different cases of sites that referred to other sites and thereby guided their visitors to physical and social spaces. Images at the Parthenon pointed to material objects of cult situated in the northern part of the Acropolis, where ancient cult sites clustered: Athena's olive tree and Poseidon's thalassa, and Athenians' ancient Agalma, only rarely visible. By doing so, they linked the Parthenon to the tradition of Athena's cult and embedded this new temple and worshippers of all times in the sacred space. The Iaccheion was built as a shrine, that is, as a sacred space, in the Agora, a multifunctional space that also housed many cult sites. Its stunning dimensions exceed any practical cultic function and reveal that its foundation and existence were a demonstration, an appropriation of the main enemy's proto-hero as a reaction to the enemy's aggression. The remarkable size and design probably copied the Aiakeion in Aegina. The site thus referred to the Aeginetan hero, to his cult, and to his cult site on Aegina. It was a sacred space on the Agora that related to a physical and a social space on Aegina. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Marion Meyer, for this wonderful lecture. You have been speaking about some sites and spaces that we have already been talking about during these 2 weeks in the framework of your doctoral seminar, focusing not only on sites as physical topographical entities, but on spaces as they are used, imagined, conceived by the communities that they refer to. So thank you very much. I open the field for questions, both in the room and online. If you have some question, please raise your hands. I will bring you the microphone. And if some of you online, in the online audience, want to ask a question, you can just raise your hands or type your question in the box. Anyone breaking the ice? Michael?
First of all, thank you for this very, very interesting lecture. I'd like to propose 2 reflections about the part about the Parthenon. I agree with I think that the Parthenon has the ability to create a new space on the Acropolis, a space where social elements are blended with mythical ones, and so social elements are reflected into the frieze of the Parthenon, and also obviously the mythical ones are reflected in the pediments and in the metops. And I really agree with this lecture. I have a question about the relationship between the pediments and the metops, because you said that in the east facade we have a Panhellenic myth, obviously the Athena's birth, and on the western facade we have a local myth, the Ares between Athena and Poseidon. I think that there is a relationship between these pediments and the metops, because on the east facade we had the gigantomachy, which represents an Olympic Athena, and so there is a connection with the pediment, and also on the western facade where we have the Amazonomachy, which is a very, very important local myth of Athens. And so I have these 2 reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comment. I really want to make this strong point, that on the east side we have these myths that place that do not really place Athens, the Athena, but do not really link her specifically to Athens. Although I think, so you give me the opportunity to at least mention that, I think that the gigantomachy, as we have it there, with all the Olympian gods involved, I do think that this was actually an Athenian invention, but generations earlier, I think that this was an invention in combination with the Pan-Athenaia, and that this played a real, that this was one of the innovations, in the earlier 6th century. But I say it was a traditional myth, at the time of the Parthenon, because it had become known, and I mean, who of those in the late 5th century would have been aware, that this was not a very old and very established myth. I'm not the first to suggest that. It was actually Luca Giuliani's idea that this, or his suggestion that the gigantomachy was actually an Athenian creation. And I checked very carefully. Of course, there are single combats of Zeus and of Heracles with giants. But what I mean is the gigantomachy as an enterprise of the entire European, the entire Olympian family. I do not agree with Giuliani's reasoning, with the argument, because he puts it in the context of the tyrannies and of competing aristocrats, whereas I think it does really have to do something with a wider concept of Athena, which in the end was a very reason to build this additional temple. The grandfather of the Parthenon, as Dinsmore said, the Parthenon, the archaic Parthenon, so to say. And I think this has rather to be seen as one element of a real of a broader politics, religious politics, so to say. But what I really want to stress, that these are myths that deliberately show Athena, as in the late 5th century, she could be explained or perceived by any visitor anywhere, just Athena as we know her from Homer, one of the Olympians. Whereas, in the West, it's this very, very strong local focus. And I find it so telling that also the Amazonomachy underneath, that this really is the Attic one, and that the Areopagos, where the Amazons camp was, right there in the back of the visitors. So this really stark contrast between the I call it Pan-Hellenic Athena and the local Athena, then really linking her to physical objects, that the visitors could see just about, some meters to the north, that this is a very, very pointed, a very focused contrast. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to emphasizing this once more.
Antonio.
Thank you, Professor, for the very stimulating lecture. I have a question regarding something you said, which I think is really striking because I didn't know that, namely the fact that the whole wooden statue of Athena is never represented iconographically in Athenian vase painting. I wonder if you have any idea regarding that. I mean, if it came to you, any hypothesis regarding this absence. Of course, I understand that after Phidias' statue of Athena, there's no match regarding, the image. But since as a historian, as historians, we know that in the 5th century, the wooden statue of Athena was at the center of many rituals of the Gene who wore it up. So I wonder if why is that?
I cannot answer this question, but I can definitely share your your wondering. The thing is, I would really not know of any image that with good reason could be identified with the Archaion Agalma. I wonder when this wooden object was actually shown, or what was actually to be seen, because it is disputed whether a rite that took an Athena statue down to Phaleron to be ritually based, whether this was the Archaion Agalma, as I think very likely, or whether it was a different Athena. But even then, this procession took place at night, and then they returned with torches, So and then, of course, when the Agalma was based, nobody would be allowed to see Athena naked. Yeah? So this would again be a ritual that would not be an open show. Yeah? So I really wonder, and I do not know, and I would be grateful for any remarks from anybody to point out, oh, here we have either written source or any context, where the Agalma is actually to be seen by more than the cult personnel. Yeah? And I do not have an explanation, but I can only say that with a lot of very, very important things, actually issues of identity, it seems to be enough to know that they are there. Yeah, that they're like things in a treasury. You know, you do not actually have to go to the Thesauros and look whether the thing that you cherish so much is there. If you know it's there, this is enough. Yeah? And we do not even know whether this Archaion Agalma remained physically the same, you know, throughout the more than 1,000 years of worship. I do think we do not know anything about its handling during the Persian Wars. I assume, together with other scholars, that of course it was taken and evacuated, but we do not have any evidence for it. You know, isn't that curious as well? Yeah, we hear about from Herodotus about the olive tree, you know, that grew again. That had you know, green leaves one day after it had been burned down, in order to demonstrate the survival and the continuity of the cult. But we do not hear that the Agalma was evacuated, that it was brought back, which it surely was, or, you know, even if something had happened, a new Agalma would have been presented. The important thing, well, I think it's really, it's good that you mentioned the Athena Parthenos. This was a statue to be viewed. And a lot of 5th century statues in other temples were really wants to be viewed, and we can trace its reception. Yeah, 100. What am I saying with 100? 10 years after the creation of the Parthenos, it is mentioned in Aristophanes. Aristophanes, you know, really refers to the Athena Parthenos. Then it is shown. It is the prototype for so many Athenas on document reliefs and other images. But the Archaion Agalma was a cult object, and the important thing was that it was there. And you know, you knew that, you know, something happened with the Agalma in the Panathenaia, and we used to think that the peplos dedicated by Athenians at the Panathenaia, either every year or only the one at the Great Panathenaia, was actually the peplos that the statue was clad in. But Wesenberg has recently wrote a whole book in which he emphasizes that there is no source, there's no ancient source that actually connects the dedication of the peplos, which is well attested, with the dress of the statue. I still think that it makes perfectly sense that the collective donation, the collective dedication, that this was accepted by the goddess, and that this was actually shown by putting this dedication on the statue. But we have to be aware of the fact that this is an assumption, whereas, you know, it is not attested. So especially concerning issues of cult, there are so many things that we either do not have in a written or not in a visual source. The most important things actually of cult actions, they simply, you know, they are simply a matter of our conjecture and our connections and our hypothesis. I cannot really answer the question, but it's good that you pointed out how curious that is.
We've got a couple of questions from the online audience. Susan Deasy says, many thanks, Marion. I love how you unpicked what constitutes a site. I have a very specific question. What was the name of the grandson of Pisistratos who established the altar of the gods in the Agora?
Pisistratos. It was Pisistratos. He was the son of Hippias.
Thank you. And also Ben Castle raised his hand, so please jump in, Ben.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Marion, for a fantastic talk. One brief comment just on what we were talking about before, the older statue of Athena Polias. I know just in terms of its composition, I know Ridgway argued some years ago that it was most likely seated based on, I think, on some terracotta statues. That's all. And one other comment, I wondered if you had any thoughts on it. It was the bombardment of themes that one would be would have to experience on the Acropolis. One couldn't turn ahead without seeing a Gigantomachy or an Amazonomachy, because of course the shield of the Parthenos as well was decorated with those themes, and the Peplops also, and then of course the Temple of Athena Nike as well, which the pediment of which also faces west over to the Areopagos. So yeah, not really a question, I suppose, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on the sheer proliferation of those themes.
No, thanks for the question with the type of the Archaion Agalma. Actually, we do not know whether it was seated or standing, because the terracottas that are found, and we also showed I showed this to the students in the seminar, just a snapshot of the showcase in the Acropolis Museum. There are Athena statues that are seated and those that are standing. The terracottas don't help. But what helps is, I think, the following line of thought. Well, it was supposed to be a very primitive piece of wood that later by Ondoyos was, refined. We don't know what exactly he did. Let's say refined. And we have inscriptions of the 4th century that give us quite some accoutrement of the statue that she must have, the statue must have acquired in the course of time, like an aegis or an owl. These are not things that a wooden agalma, let's say of the 7th century, would have. So there were continuous, there was a continuous working with the statue, so to speak. Yeah. But we do have this late source that the agalma turned around in the context of Antonius and the Mark Antony and yes. Augustan war, and turned around and spat blood. And yes. So I think even for a goddess to turn around would be, easier to manage if she is standing than if she is seated. And at any time, to be seated is a very special motif in Greek art. It always calls for a special reason, for a special justification, so to speak. And especially for Athena, I would think that a standing statue would be more appropriate. I mean, just considering the probably very high age of this agalma, and I think it is really a very old image, not only because it's one of the few occult statues that is actually attested as being among the oldest, and there are not so many. There is just 5 or 6. It's not that every city claimed to have a very, very old agalma. So I think it is really a very ancient agalma. I don't know how old it is, but the first temple probably dates to around 700 on the Acropolis, and this kind of presupposes the image, but it might well have been even older and kept, in a ruler's dwelling before it was actually put into a temple. But this is all speculation. The only thing that I want to say is we do not know whether it was seated or standing. I think there are arguments, reasons, especially this turning around thing, that speaks for a standing statue, and also the long pedigree. That's what I would say. And then speaking of the Amazonomachy and of the Centauromachy and all these myths, yeah, they recur. They are also depicted on the Athena Promachos, the so-called Promachos, the big colossal bronze statue. And there I also think that the myths have a special meaning. For example, the Centauromachy, they actually show the penalty for hubris, but and this is an antagonism between neighbors. So I think this might very well be a warning of the allies. That might be directed towards the allies. So I think that the specific choice and the placing of these traditional myths have to be interpreted in their time and in their setting. So the Promachos, the open, has a different audience in a way, or a different addresses, a different, not a different audience, but has an additional function, or has a different function from the Parthenon, which is so much a building, that really immortalizes the cult. And then the Athena Nike is altogether in a different historical situation and with a different message, and also, of course, for the Athenians and for the League, but then in a different context altogether.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions or comments? We've got time for one question or two, depending on how long they are. I'll ask a question myself, if I may. I'm very much interested in what you said about the competition between the Eginetans and the Athenians around, let's say, the kinship myth of the Aiakids. Which are the arguments adduced by those who think that the pediments of the temple of Athena, Aphaia in Aegina presuppose the Persian Wars, and which are your own arguments against this recent reading that they are post-Persian?
I do not think that I can answer so quickly. No. There are a lot of reasons for down dating the statues, which does not mean that I think there are a lot of good reasons. But some question even the stylistic differences. Then there is a general tendency in down dating a lot of sculpture that we would call archaic, just by description. Then there is a very, very unuseful, because not solvable, debate about the pottery found in the foundation of the terrace of the Aphaia temple. And this pottery has been analyzed 30 or 40 years ago. That was Stuart's counter argument against my my critique of his down dating. But we cannot date the simple pottery so exactly, as to say this must be before 480 or after 480. The only thing I can say that those who try to argue with the pottery in the foundation and the comparisons with the pottery from the Agora have failed to tell me why their down dating should be convincing. I'm not a pottery specialist, but it's really hard, to make a chronological claim that, when it comes down to very few years. Some archaeologists think that this prestigious temple, that it took a special incentive to have first the temple, second Second, this rich sculpture. We do not have any evidence that the Persians landed on Aegina and that they burned the temple. But recently, the architecture, and of course, not only the architecture of this temple, but the architecture of related buildings in Delphi and on the Cyclades, in other places, this has been come under new critique, and there are new chronologies for the architectural sequence of these buildings have been suggested, as far as the architecture is concerned, I think maybe new studies and new measurements might really bring some clarification, whereas I cannot really see how the pottery issue could be solved. With my arguments, I cannot say anything about the date of the pediments. I mean, with this reasoning, you cannot say the Aeginetans reacted immediately or 10 years or 20 years later. The only thing that I am saying is that an argument to say, oh, before 480, the Aeginetans didn't have any reason, to come back to this or to propagate this, that this does not hold. They did have very good reason, ever since 500, and this conflict had been going on, and also especially this antagonism with the genealogy. So this is my only contribution, and then I do think that there is a stylistical difference, but to suggest a definite date, this takes a kind of evidence that I do not see either in the pottery, nor in the sculpture, nor in the architecture in this moment. But this might also be because I am not in these architectural studies right now. We had a workshop last year in Munich, and a lot of things were discussed, and I realized that there is something, just in. Well, we will see whether new arguments come up. Sorry, I cannot really give a more satisfying.
You said you could not answer, but you did answer. So thank you. Any other questions or comments? The online audience? Otherwise, we can leave it up here. And thank you once again, Marion Meyer, for today's lecture and for sharing her expertise with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.